In the heart of a solemn courtroom, something unthinkable happened. Everyone present, judges, attorneys, onlookers, froze in disbelief. A uniformed police officer, face stiff with hostility, stepped forward and struck Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. No one moved. No one breathed. It wasn't just an act of physical aggression. It was a moment charged with raw, unfiltered racial tension, the kind that history remembers. Why would a law enforcement officer dare to strike a sitting U.S. Congresswoman, a black woman, in full view of cameras and colleagues? What pushed him beyond reason and into the depths of rage? Gasps filled the room. Some stood in shock. Others covered their mouths. But amid the chaos, only one person stayed calm. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She slowly raised her hand to the place where she was struck and then lifted her head, not in fear, not in anger, but with a fire in her eyes that said, "You just proved my point." And then came the moment no one expected. 9 minutes later, with nothing but her voice, her truth, and her unwavering resolve, Jasmine Crockett delivered a statement so powerful, so undeniable, that the entire courtroom, judges, press, lawmakers, were left speechless. In those 9 minutes, she flipped the entire system on its head. Not with fists, not with fury, but with the kind of truth that makes power tremble. Before that courtroom slap became a symbol, before her name began trending worldwide, Jasmine Crockett was already a force to be reckoned with. A former civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, she wasn't new to confrontation. She had spent years in the trenches, fighting against unjust prosecutions, defending the voiceless, and standing firm in the face of systemic oppression. For her, the courtroom wasn't a stage. It was a battlefield where truth was her weapon. Born and raised in the South, Jasmine knew what racism looked like. She knew the subtle stares, the coded language, the doors that silently stayed closed. But she also knew the law, and more importantly, she knew how to use it. By the time she walked into that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had already been labeled by many as too bold, too sharp, too unapologetic. But she wore those labels like armor. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to speak truth. So when that officer lifted his hand, thinking he could silence her with violence, what he didn't realize was this. He had just handed the microphone to the wrong woman. Because Jasmine doesn't back down. She leans in. She turns pain into power. And she makes sure the whole world is watching. That slap? It wasn't a victory for him. It was the spark that lit the fire she'd been carrying all her life. And that fire was about to burn down every excuse the system had left. Silence. That was the first sound that followed the slap. Not screams, not gasps, just silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the air had been vacuumed out of the room. A silence that wrapped around everyone, judges, reporters, staffers, like an invisible chain, locking their bodies in place. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting to see what Jasmine Crockett would do next. And then she moved. Slowly, she straightened her back, adjusted the collar of her pink blazer, brushed her cheek, not to wipe away tears because there were none, but as if she were brushing away the very insult that had just been hurled at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't crumble. She rose. "I want this on record," she said, her voice firm, unwavering, every syllable slicing through the silence like a blade. "What just happened wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on every black woman who's ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to not make it about race." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The police officer who had struck her, still standing just feet away, now looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. And as the cameras kept rolling, Jasmine Crockett began to speak. And for the next 9 minutes, she didn't stop. She spoke about the history of violence against black women, how they'd been beaten, silenced, ignored. She spoke about the hypocrisy of a system that punishes the oppressed for speaking up, yet protects the hands that harm them. She quoted court cases, legal precedents, and constitutional rights, not with notes, not with a script, but from memory, with passion, with precision. "Let the world see this," she said. "Let the world see that in 2025, a sitting U.S. Congresswoman can be struck by law enforcement inside a courtroom for asking a question. You could hear a pin drop. The question is not whether he should be punished, she continued, pointing at the officer. The real question is, how many others like him have done the same thing when there were no cameras rolling? How many voices have been silenced before they ever reached this room? One of the aides near the back wiped away a tear. Another person clenched their fist, jaw tight, as if trying to hold in the shame of the truth she had just unmasked. And Jasmine kept going. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't need to, because when you speak with truth, when you stand on principle, the room listens. She called out the system, not just for what allowed to happen in that courtroom, but for the decades, the centuries of silence it had enabled. She didn't just demand accountability. She demanded reckoning. For too long, she said, we've been told to stay composed while we're being broken, to be civil while we're being disrespected, to follow the rules written by those who never had to live under them. And that's when it happened. One by one, people began to rise. A young law student in the back stood first, then another, and another. Within seconds, half the courtroom was on its feet, not cheering, not yet, but standing in solemn solidarity. Even some of the congressional staffers, people who had been trained to remain neutral, to avoid taking sides, rose to their feet, unable to remain seated any longer. The judge, now visibly rattled, leaned into the microphone and said, Congresswoman Crockett, you've made your point. But Jasmine wasn't finished. No, Your Honor, she said calmly, I haven't. Not until this body, this courtroom, and this country stop pretending that these moments are isolated incidents. They are patterns. They are symptoms of a disease that no one wants to name. She turned to the cameras. And now you've seen it. The slap wasn't the story. The slap was just the beginning. By the time she finished, the room wasn't just quiet. It was transformed. No longer a courtroom. It had become a witness stand for an entire system on trial. The officer who struck her was escorted out, silently, without a word of defense. The presiding judge, after a long pause, was forced to issue a public apology right then and there. And Jasmine? She walked out of that courtroom not as a victim, but as a voice, one that could no longer be ignored. Outside, crowds had already gathered. Reporters, activists, students. They had seen the live feed. They had heard every word. And they weren't there to protest. They were there to stand with her. In just 9 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had turned a slap into a spotlight. She turned pain into a platform. She took the very hand that tried to silence her and used its violence as proof that everything she had been fighting for was real. And in that moment, the system didn't just look weak. It looked ashamed. The slap may have happened inside a courtroom, but its echoes reached far beyond those four walls. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courthouse, the world was already watching. The video of the incident, unedited, raw, and painfully real, had gone viral within minutes. News channels interrupted regular programming. Hashtags exploded across social media. Hashtag Justice for Jasmine. Hashtag She Did Not Flinch. Hashtag 9 Minutes of Truth. Everyone had seen it. The slap, the silence, the fire in her voice, and then the standing ovation that followed. But what no one expected was what happened next. Within 24 hours, national leaders spoke out. Senators issued public statements condemning the officer's behavior. Civil rights organizations released formal letters demanding accountability, not just for this incident, but for the systemic culture that made it possible. Protesters gathered in front of government buildings, holding signs that said, "She stood for all of us." Jasmine spoke. Now it's our turn. Late night shows replayed clips of her speech. Commentators were left speechless, not by the slap, but by how she responded. Calm, calculated, commanding. She didn't retaliate with anger. She retaliated with truth. And that truth was something the nation could no longer look away from. The officer in question was suspended indefinitely. An internal investigation was launched immediately, not just into his actions that day, but into his entire career history. Allegations began surfacing. Whispers of past misconduct, complaints that had been buried. But now nothing could be buried. Jasmine's voice had dug all up. Meanwhile, members of Congress who had remained silent on police misconduct suddenly found themselves under pressure to respond. The incident wasn't someone else's district anymore. It was America's mirror, and it wasn't pretty. Petitions began circulating, demanding sweeping reforms in courtroom security, police conduct, and racial bias training. Thousands of signatures poured in, and at the center of it all was her, Jasmine Crockett, now no longer just a congresswoman. She was a movement. But Jasmine didn't revel in the attention. She didn't go on a media tour. She didn't capitalize on the outrage. Instead, she got back to work. She stood on the Capitol steps the following week, surrounded by survivors, activists, and fellow lawmakers, and introduced what she called the Silent No More Act, a bold legislative package aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement, especially in courtrooms. And during her speech, she said this: "I didn't ask for that moment, but I'm going to use it, because if they think they can slap us in silence, then they've forgotten one thing. We never stay quiet for long." Her words didn't just shake the room. They shook the country. Major media outlets ran op-eds calling her the voice of a generation. Law schools began analyzing her courtroom speech as a case study in rhetorical power and civil resistance. Black girls across the country began posting TikToks and Instagram videos mimicking her calm stare and the iconic moment she stood up after the slap. Even those who once criticized her for being too confrontational now found themselves redefining what strength looked like. But perhaps the most powerful reaction didn't come from the press. It came from the people. Letters flooded her office from across the country. Mothers, students, retirees, former inmates. Many of them had never written to a politician in their lives, but they had seen her. They had felt something shift. One letter read, "When you stood there and didn't back down, I saw my daughter. I saw the future. Thank you for showing us how to rise." Another said, "I'm a white man from Iowa. I've never understood what black women go through until I saw what they did to you. I am sorry. I'm listening now." And Jasmine, she kept going. She gave no space for pity, no room for victimhood. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a masterclass in power. For every person who had ever been silenced in a courtroom, for every woman who had ever been told she was too loud, for every voice that had been erased, she spoke. She stood. She shattered the silence. And that's how one slap, meant to diminish her, instead amplified her to a volume the system could no longer mute. Jasmine Crockett didn't just endure an assault. She turned it into an awakening. And now, the whole nation was wide awake. History doesn't always knock. Sometimes it slaps. And when it does, we're left with a choice: to shrink in fear or to rise with purpose. Jasmine Crockett chose to rise. What began as a shameful moment of violence became a turning point, not just for her, not just for black women, but for a system that had long convinced itself it was untouchable. In a nation where silence often shields injustice, Jasmine's voice cut through like thunder, sharp, undeniable, and deeply human. She didn't ask to be a symbol, but when the moment called, she became one anyway. And that's the thing about real power. It doesn't come from titles or badges or gavels. It comes from knowing who you are, even when the world tries to make you forget. In the months that followed, we saw change. The Silent No More Act gained bipartisan support. Officers in federal buildings faced new psychological screening protocols. Mandatory racial bias training was implemented in 3 new states. But more than policy, a conversation had been reignited, the kind that makes people uncomfortable, the kind that forces reflection. Teachers began discussing the incident in classrooms. Faith leaders brought her words to their sermons. Civil rights legends called her privately to say, "You reminded us why we started this in the first place." And yet, Jasmine Crockett never called herself a hero. "I'm not extraordinary," she once said in an interview. "I just refused to be quiet when it mattered most." But to millions, that refusal was everything. It reminded us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands calmly in the fire and dares the world to keep watching. So the next time someone tells you to stay in your place, the next time the system tries to mute your truth, remember her. Remember how a single woman, with no weapon but her voice, brought a courtroom to its knees. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for everyone who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or erased. And she made sure the world listened. This wasn't just justice. This was history. They tried to silence her with a slap. She answered with a revolution.